deep in the heart of the wilderness, where the trees whisper secrets and the shadows stretch too long. Nightmares become real. Tonight we bring you 10 terrifying true stories of cabins in the woods, tales of the lost, the hunted, and those who never came back. Lock your doors, check the windows, and whatever you do, don't go outside. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend at my uncle's remote cabin. No internet, no neighbors, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I had been there many times before, but this visit was different. The first night was uneventful. I read a book by the fireplace and fell asleep early. But on the second night, I woke up suddenly, feeling uneasy. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden walls. Then I heard it, footsteps on the porch. I held my breath. It was late. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Then a faint knock at the door. Not loud, just a gentle tap, tap, tap. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated before looking out the window. My heart pounded. No one was there. The knocking stopped. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe I imagined it. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Bare human footprints circling the entire cabin. But they didn't lead to the cabin. They only led away. It was as if someone had been standing there the whole time, watching. I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, I packed my bags and left. My uncle still owns the cabin, but I've never been back, and I never will. I grew up spending summers at my family's remote cabin deep in the woods. It was old, isolated, and had a strange, unsettling energy about it. But as a kid, I never thought much of it. A few years ago, I went back alone for a weekend getaway. I hadn't been there in years, and nostalgia hit me hard as I walked through the creaky wooden door. Everything was just as I remembered, except for one thing. In the small storage shed beside the cabin, I found an old notebook. It looked familiar. When I flipped through it, my stomach dropped. It was my childhood notebook. My name was written inside, and I recognized my handwriting from when I was about 10 years old. But something wasn't right. There were new entries written in it, and they weren't mine. The handwriting was different, jagged, and frantic. Page after page, it repeated the same chilling sentence. I see you. I know you're here. I slammed the notebook shut and ran back inside, locking the door. My mind raced. Who had been here? How did they find my old notebook? Had they been watching me all these years? That night I barely slept. Every sound outside sent me into a panic. The next morning, I left and never went back. The worst part, I still have no idea who wrote in that notebook. I love hiking and camping, but after what happened to me a few years ago, I can't go into the woods alone anymore. I was on a solo camping trip in a dense forest, about 30 miles from the nearest town. I had set up camp near an old abandoned cabin that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The roof was caving in, the windows were shattered, and the door hung off its hinges. I should have taken it as a bad sign, but I ignored it. That night, as I sat by my fire, I started to hear whispers. Faint at first, but growing louder. It wasn't the wind. It was voices. Low, rhythmic chanting. Like a ritual. I turned off my flashlight and listened, my heart pounding. The voices were coming from the trees. I grabbed my knife and held my breath. Suddenly I noticed something even worse. Strange symbols carved into the trees around my campsite. They hadn't been there before. Then I saw it. A figure just beyond the fire's glow. Tall, unmoving, watching me. I shined my flashlight, but the second the beam hit the trees, it was gone. I didn't sleep. At the first sign of daylight, I packed up and ran back to my car. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but someone had been out there, watching, waiting. I never camp alone anymore. A few years ago, my friends and I rented a remote cabin deep in the woods for a weekend getaway. No neighbors, no cell service, just us and the wilderness. The first night was great. We grilled food, told ghost stories, and laughed around the fire. By midnight, everyone had gone to bed. I was the last one awake, finishing my drink on the porch when I heard it, a loud thud against the cabin wall. I froze. It sounded like something big had slammed into the side of the cabin. My first thought was a bear, but then came a sound that sent chills through my entire body. It was a whimper, a low, painful cry, like an injured animal. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly walked around the cabin. The sound was coming from the woods. I shined the light into the darkness, and for a split second, I saw something move. It was low to the ground, crawling. But then, it stood up. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before it took off running, on all fours. I bolted inside, locked the doors, and woke my friends. We stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. By morning, we found footprints circling the cabin. But they weren't normal footprints. They started out human. Then halfway through, they changed. Something had been watching us, and whatever it wasn't entirely human. It was supposed to be just another hiking trip. My friend and I had been exploring the mountains for years, but this time we stumbled upon something neither of us could explain. Deep in the forest, miles away from any marked trails, we found an old abandoned cabin. The wood was rotting, the windows shattered, and the front door hung open as if waiting for us. Against my better judgment, we went inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was damp, moldy, but there was something else, something metallic, like rust or blood. Inside, the cabin was nearly empty except for a wooden chair and a small table. But on the walls were drawings, hundreds of them, carved into the wood with something sharp. Figures with hollow eyes, twisted faces, and long claw-like hands. Some of them had smiling mouths. Others had no mouths at all. Then my friend whispered, "Look at the floor." I felt my stomach drop. The dust had been disturbed. Someone had been here, recently. Suddenly we heard a creak from the back room, a slow, deliberate sound, like a footstep on old wood. We didn't wait to find out who or what was inside. We ran. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we realized something even worse. The trees around us had the same carvings, and they stretched for miles. My family owns a small cabin deep in the woods. It's been in our family for generations, and while I've always loved going there, I've also always felt uneasy. One weekend, I decided to go alone to clear my head. I arrived late in the evening, lit a fire, and settled in with a book. That's when I heard it, a door slamming shut. I froze. The cabin was small. There was only one door, and it hadn't moved. I brushed it off as the wind, until I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, inside the cabin. My heart nearly stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and looked around. No one was there. Trying to shake the fear, I locked the door, bolted the windows, and went to bed. But I woke up in the middle of the night to whispering. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was whispering just outside my window. I was too scared to move. But then, my bedroom door creaked open. I forced myself to look. The door was wide open. The hallway was pitch black. And then I heard breathing. I grabbed my keys, sprinted to my car, and didn't stop driving until I reached town. The next morning, I returned with a friend. Everything inside the cabin was exactly how I left it. Except for one thing. On the dusty floor near my bed were bare footprints. They weren't mine. My family has a small vacation cabin in the mountains. It's secluded, surrounded by trees, and the closest neighbor is miles away. It's always been my escape from the world, until one terrifying night changed everything. I had gone up for a weekend alone. The first night was peaceful, but on the second night, something strange happened. Around midnight, I heard a soft creaking outside, like footsteps on the wooden porch. I turned off the lights and peeked out the window. There was a man standing on the porch. He wasn't moving. He wasn't knocking. He was just standing there, staring at the door. I stayed perfectly still, hoping he would leave, but he didn't. He just stood there for what felt like hours. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was too wide, too forced, like he was enjoying my fear. Then, without a word, he turned and walked into the woods. No flashlight, no hesitation, just disappeared into the darkness. I barely slept that night, and at sunrise I packed up and left. A week later, my uncle, who owns the cabin, called me. He had gone up for the weekend and found something disturbing. On the porch, in the dust, were 2 words carved into the wood. "See you." A friend of mine had a terrifying experience while camping near an old cabin in a remote part of the woods. They were out there with a group of people, and while most of them stayed near the campfire, my friend decided to take a walk and explore the area. While wandering through the trees, they came across the dilapidated cabin. It was surrounded by dense woods, and the place felt incredibly old, with broken windows and overgrown vines. But despite its state of decay, there was something unsettling about it. It almost seemed as if it were waiting for someone to come inside. Curious, my friend pushed the door open and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they explored the main room. On one wall, they noticed some strange symbols painted in what looked like old blood. The atmosphere was oppressive, like the air itself was thick with some kind of energy. Then they heard a creaking sound from upstairs. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was walking around up there. Terrified, my friend hurried out of the cabin and rushed back to camp. But when they told the group what happened, no one believed them. They chalked it up to nerves. But that night, something even stranger happened. As they sat around the campfire, they heard footsteps outside their tents, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing around the camp. When they checked, there was nothing there. The next morning, they left early. But to this day, they can't shake the feeling that someone was watching them from that cabin. A couple of years ago, I went on a solo hiking trip in a remote part of the forest, hoping for some solitude and a break from the hustle of city life. I wandered for hours, enjoying the peace of the wilderness, when I stumbled across an old abandoned cabin hidden deep in the woods. It wasn't on any maps, and it seemed like it had been there for a very long time. The cabin looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. Rotten wood, broken windows, and weeds growing through the floorboards. Curious, I decided to take a look inside. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and I stepped into the musty, dark interior. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the floor was covered in dust. At first, there was nothing unusual about it, except for the eerie silence. But as I walked deeper into the cabin, I noticed something strange. Scattered around the room were personal belongings, old clothes, a few tarnished metal utensils, and a pile of newspapers. It was as if someone had been living there, but there was no sign of them now. Then I found it, the journal. It was tucked away under a floorboard in the corner. The pages were yellowed, and the ink was smudged in places. but I could still make out the handwriting. The last entry sent a cold shiver down my spine. It read, "I'm not sure how long I've been here. There's something in the woods watching me. I hear footsteps outside at night, and I swear I see eyes peeking through the windows. I need to leave, but I can't." Suddenly I heard a creak behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The air felt heavier, suffocating almost. I ran out of the cabin, my heart pounding, and didn't stop until I was back at my car. To this day, I have no idea who lived there or what happened to them. But I'm sure of one thing. Something had been watching me, and it didn't want me to leave. My family and I rented a cabin in the Smoky Mountains for a week. It was beautiful, peaceful, and pretty isolated, which is exactly what we wanted. The first couple of days were perfect. Hiking, sightseeing, just enjoying the fresh mountain air. Then on the third night, something happened that I still can't explain. At around 2 a.m., we were all woken up by the security alarm blaring. This alarm was specifically set to go off only if a door was opened. My heart was pounding as I jumped out of bed. My first thought was that someone had broken in. I grabbed the flashlight and checked both the front and back doors. They were locked. Every single window shut and latched. I double-checked the system. There was no malfunction, no power surge, nothing that could have triggered it by accident. At that point, my wife and I were completely unsettled. We barely slept for the rest of the night, and the next morning, we asked the rental office if there had been any previous reports of strange occurrences in the cabin. The lady behind the counter hesitated before saying, "Not that I know of," but I swear I saw something in her expression, like she was hiding something. We still had a few nights left in our stay, but I couldn't relax after that. Every single night I lay awake, listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. To this day, I have no explanation for it, and I'm not sure I want one. A few years ago, my friends and I rented a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend getaway. It was a small, rustic place. No Wi-Fi, barely any phone signal, and completely surrounded by dense trees. The first night was uneventful. We drank, played games, and told scary stories, just for fun. But on the second night, something horrifying happened. We had all gone to bed around 1 a.m., and I was sleeping in the smallest bedroom, which had just one window facing the woods. At some point during the night, I woke up with that weird feeling, like I was being watched. I rolled over to face the window. There was a face looking in at me. It wasn't pressed against the glass, but I could see it clearly in the moonlight. Pale skin, wide, staring eyes, and an expression that was wrong. It was almost like it was smiling, but not in a normal way. I was frozen. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. After what felt like forever, I finally worked up the nerve to reach for my phone and shine the flashlight at the window. There was nothing there. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning I went outside to check, and that's when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt beneath my window. They led from the forest, but there were no tracks leading back. Whoever or whatever had been watching me never walked away. A few years ago, I took a solo camping trip in a remote part of the Pacific Northwest. I had been feeling stressed with work and life, so I figured a few days off the grid would do me good. I packed my gear, hiked deep into the woods, and eventually found an old abandoned cabin near a small river. It looked like no one had been there in decades. Windows were broken, the wood was rotting, and nature was reclaiming it. But for some reason, I had a bad feeling about it. The place felt wrong. The silence around it was unnatural, like even the animals avoided it. I set up camp a little ways off, but curiosity got the better of me. Before the sun went down, I decided to check out the inside. The door was already slightly open, creaking as I pushed it. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with old newspapers and rusted tools. And then I saw it. In the corner of the cabin was a wooden chair facing the door, and sitting in that chair was a man. Or at least, it looked like a man. His skin was gray and leathery, stretched too tightly over his bones. He was wearing old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd expect from the early 1900s. His hands were resting on the arms of the chair, but his fingernails were long and yellowed, curling at the ends. The worst part, his eyes were open, but they were dry and sunken, like he had been sitting there for decades. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat, and as I did, I heard something outside, footsteps in the leaves. I turned to look out the broken window, expecting to see an animal. But instead I saw a man standing in the trees, watching me. He was wearing the exact same clothes as the thing in the chair. I didn't wait to get a better look. I bolted out of that cabin, grabbed my gear, and ran. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back at my truck. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know if it was a ghost, something supernatural, or something worse. But I do know this. That thing in the chair wasn't dead, and whatever was watching me didn't want me there. A few years ago, I stayed in an old hunting cabin that belonged to a friend of my grandfather's. It was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest paved road, with no electricity and barely any cell signal. It was perfectly isolated, and for a while, it was peaceful. During the day, I hiked, fished, and chopped wood for the fireplace. But as soon as the sun went down, the entire mood changed. The cabin felt too quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid, but by the time I turned in for the night, I was on edge. Then, around midnight, I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. Someone was at the door. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. No one should have been out there. No one even knew I was staying there. I grabbed my flashlight, tiptoed to the door, and took a deep breath before knocking back 3 times, just to see if I was imagining things. For a moment, there was silence. Then, knock, knock, knock. Something knocked back. I froze. It wasn't an echo, and it wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. I didn't dare open the door. Instead, I turned off my flashlight and crept to the window, trying to see who or what was out there. The porch was empty. No movement, no retreating footsteps, nothing. Then, just as I started to pull away from the window, I saw something in the yard. A figure. It was too tall, almost inhumanly tall, standing in the tree line just beyond the clearing. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel it watching me. I backed away, grabbed my hunting rifle, and locked myself in the bedroom. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, listening. For the rest of the night, I heard scraping against the walls of the cabin, light taps on the windows, faint whispers that I couldn't understand. By dawn, everything stopped. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my things and got out of there as fast as I could. When I told my grandfather's friend what happened, his face went pale. He said, "You're not the first person to hear knocking at that cabin." I never went back, and I never will. My partner and I decided to get away for the weekend and rented a secluded cabin deep in the forest. It was one of those places that was so quiet it almost felt like time was standing still. At first it was perfect, just what we needed. But things took a turn the first night we were there. Around 11 p.m. we were lying in bed, talking and winding down. Suddenly we heard whispers, faint, almost like a voice coming from outside. We both stopped talking and listened. I figured it was probably just the wind rustling the trees, but the voices, they were so clear. I got up and went to the window, looking out into the darkness with the flashlight. I couldn't see anyone, but the whispers didn't stop. It was like they were coming from all around us. I opened the door and stepped outside, but as soon as I did, the whispers stopped. That night I didn't sleep. I kept hearing those voices, like they were right outside the door, but every time I looked, there was no one there. We stayed for 2 more nights, but the whispers never stopped, and each night they got louder. On the last night, I saw something in the trees, just a silhouette of someone standing there, staring directly at me. It wasn't until I blinked that it was gone. That was it. We packed up and left at 3 a.m. As we drove away, I swear I heard the whispers following us. It felt like they were in my head, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling since. I rented a cabin by myself for a weekend retreat to clear my head. It was in a remote part of the woods. No neighbors for miles. The first day was nice. I spent it fishing, hiking, and just enjoying the quiet. That night I settled in, made some food, and then tried to relax in front of the fire. Around midnight, I was just about to drift off to sleep when I heard a knock on the door. I froze. The knock came again, and I thought maybe it was just an animal or some sort of weird noise. But then it came again. 3 knocks, one after the other. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and cautiously opened the door. There was no one there, just the night air and the sound of trees swaying in the breeze. I figured I was just being paranoid, so I closed the door and locked it. But about an hour later, it happened again. 3 knocks, this time much louder. This time I didn't open the door. I just stood there in the dark, holding the flashlight and listening. After a long silence, I heard footsteps on the porch. But when I shined the light outside, there was no one. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things and drove out of there, and when I got home, I checked the door. There were muddy footprints leading up to the door, but nothing leading away. The weirdest part, the knocks stopped after I left. It was like whatever it was, it wanted me to leave. I haven't gone back to that cabin since. A group of friends and I rented a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip, but things quickly took a strange turn. We got there in the afternoon, and everything seemed fine. The cabin was cozy and the area was peaceful, until the fog rolled in. The fog came so quickly that by sunset, it was thick and dense. You couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. That night, the fog was still there, and the sounds from the forest became unsettling. We started hearing footsteps around the cabin, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and even some whispers carried by the wind. We tried to brush it off as animals, but then we started to see figures moving in the fog. People, shapes. At first it was just shadows, but as we stared harder, we could see them more clearly. We went outside to check it out, but the figures were always just a few steps away from us. Every time we tried to approach them, they would vanish into the fog. It felt like we were being watched the entire time. By the end of the night, none of us could sleep. We stayed huddled together, afraid to leave the cabin. The fog eventually cleared, but the feeling of being watched stayed with us the whole weekend. None of us talked about what we saw, but we all knew something was out there, and we weren't going back. I was out in the woods one weekend with a friend. and we found an old abandoned cabin that we decided to explore. It was just sitting there, isolated and seemingly untouched by time. There were no doors, only a few broken windows. The wood was decaying, and the floor was covered in leaves and dirt. But there was something strangely eerie about it. As we stepped inside, we noticed old photographs hanging on the walls, pictures of people we didn't recognize. Each picture had one thing in common. The eyes of the people in the photos had all been scratched out. My friends started to laugh, saying it was probably just some weird art installation or something. But I felt this strange unease. We started looking around more. The place was full of broken furniture and abandoned stuff. But there was something off about the air. It was thick and still. We were about to leave when we heard footsteps outside. At first, we figured it was just an animal. But then we heard them stop right in front of the door. I looked through the cracked window, but I didn't see anyone. Then I looked at the door, and it was slowly opening from the outside. I grabbed my friend, and we tried to leave, but the windows we'd come through were suddenly boarded up. We were trapped. We spent the rest of the night in the cabin, hearing scratching noises on the walls and whispers that seemed to come from everywhere. We couldn't get out until the morning light finally gave us the courage to leave. I inherited my uncle's cabin after he passed away, so I decided to spend the weekend there and get some peace and quiet. The cabin was in a remote part of the woods, and my uncle had always talked about how he'd seen strange things there. But I thought it was just his imagination. On my first night there, I found an old journal my uncle had kept about his experiences in the cabin. He wrote about strange noises, sightings of shadowy figures, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. I laughed it off and assumed he was just paranoid. Later that night, though, I started hearing things. At first, it was just the wind, but as the night went on, I heard footsteps on the porch. I checked outside, but no one was there. I thought I was just being paranoid. The next morning, I found footprints leading into the woods, but there were no tracks leading back. I don't know why, but that scared me more than anything. I decided to leave, but as I packed my stuff, I looked out the window and saw a figure standing just inside the tree line. I couldn't see its face, but it was wearing the same clothes as the person my uncle had described in his journal. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I left the cabin and I haven't gone back. The footprints were gone by the time I returned, but I'll never forget the feeling that something was waiting for me out there. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to take a weekend trip to an isolated cabin we'd rented in the middle of nowhere. We were all looking for a break from the hustle of everyday life, so the remote setting seemed perfect. It was deep in the forest, about 30 minutes from the nearest town. We didn't expect any interruptions. just a few days of peace and relaxation. When we arrived at the cabin, it was older than we'd expected, but it had a cozy charm. It was one of those cabins that looked a bit run down, but still comfortable enough for a short stay. The windows were old and a bit foggy. The wood had a faded patina, and there was a small fireplace in the corner. Still, we were excited and settled in for a long weekend. The first couple of hours were perfect. We unpacked, played games, and explored the surrounding woods. It wasn't until nighttime that things started to get weird. We'd all settled around the fireplace, joking and laughing, when suddenly we heard a soft knock on the door. We all froze. We weren't expecting anyone, and there was no one else around for miles. I went to the door and opened it, but there was nothing there. I stepped outside to check, and all I could see was the pitch-black woods stretching out in every direction. I shook it off and came back inside, but the mood had shifted. The next knock came about an hour later. This time, I felt a little more unsettled, but I opened the door again. Nothing. I closed it a little more forcefully this time, and we all decided to ignore it. But after that, things escalated. Later that evening, we heard a soft voice, just a faint whisper that seemed to come from somewhere outside. It was a woman's voice, calling out, though we couldn't make out the words. We all got up and looked through the windows, but the outside was just darkness. That's when things started to feel off. We could hear movement just outside, like someone was walking around the cabin. The trees rustled, and I even thought I saw something moving in the shadows. But no one was there. Eventually, we tried to get some sleep, but none of us could shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, everything seemed normal again, but we couldn't ignore the creeping suspicion that something was wrong. We decided to hike to a nearby river, hoping to clear our heads. As we walked, we came across an old abandoned house deep in the woods, something we hadn't seen the day before. It was crumbling and overgrown, with vines wrapping around the windows and doors. The roof looked like it was about to collapse. We took a look around, and that's when we found something strange. In the front yard, there was a stone slab, partially buried under dirt and leaves. We cleared it away and discovered an old weathered grave marker. The engraving was faded, but we could still make out the name, Margaret Branson. We didn't think much of it at first, but the moment we turned to leave, we heard a loud banging noise from the direction of the cabin. Our hearts skipped a beat, and we rushed back as quickly as we could. When we reached the cabin, it was completely still, and there was no sign of anything unusual. That night, things got much worse. We were sitting by the fire when we heard a loud knock on the door, this time much harder than before. It was almost as if the door was about to break. We all jumped up and stared at each other, unsure of what to do. Then we heard the voice again. A woman's whisper, almost a wail, calling out from the woods. We didn't open the door this time. Instead, we barricaded ourselves inside, too afraid to even look out the windows. As the night wore on, we started hearing scratching noises. Something was clawing at the wood. It came from every direction, the walls, the windows, the door. The entire cabin felt like it was under siege. The sounds grew louder, and then we heard something that chilled us to the bone. Footsteps, heavy and slow, coming up the stairs to the front porch. We were all frozen in place. We could hear the creak of the floorboards on the porch, the soft thud of each step as someone, or something, approached the door. We were all holding our breath when the door suddenly burst open with a loud crash. The door flew off its hinges and slammed against the wall, and standing in the doorway was an old woman, hunched over, her long white hair hanging in front of her face. Her skin was pale and almost translucent, and she was wearing a long, tattered dress. Her eyes were wide and glassy, and she just stood there, staring at us. Before any of us could react, she let out a scream, a high-pitched, horrible shriek that seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. It felt like the air was being sucked out of the room. We scrambled to get away, but the woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring. One of my friends managed to grab the old hunting rifle we'd brought, and as soon as he raised it to shoot, the woman disappeared into thin air. 1 second, she was standing there, and the next, she was gone. Just like that. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, we packed up and left. But even as we drove away, we couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still watching us. We didn't talk about it until we got back to town, but each of us knew something had happened that we couldn't explain. That night was the last time I ever went anywhere near those woods. This happened about 2 years ago. I went on a solo trip to a remote cabin in the woods, hoping to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life and do some writing. I'd found the cabin through an old website that listed secluded rentals in rural areas. The pictures looked perfect, rustic, quiet, and far from civilization. I booked it for a weekend, packed up my things, and drove out there. The drive was long and isolated, taking me deeper into the forest with each mile. When I finally arrived, I was relieved to see the cabin standing exactly where the listing had described it, tucked away at the edge of a clearing. It looked just like the pictures, weathered but charming. There was no one around, no other signs of life, just trees and stillness. It felt like I had the whole forest to myself. The first night was peaceful. I made a fire, enjoyed some food, and relaxed in the quiet. The forest felt calm, almost alive, as if everything was in harmony. But when I went to bed, that's when things started to get strange. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. I figured it was just an animal at first, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard a knocking on the door. It was soft at first, then louder, almost like someone was gently banging on it. I was immediately on edge, but tried to stay calm. There was no way anyone could be out here, right? The nearest neighbor was miles away. I turned on the flashlight and checked the windows. No one. I cautiously opened the door to look around, but there was nothing, just the moonlight filtering through the trees. The air was cold, and the night was dead silent. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to bed. But the unsettling feeling stuck with me. The next day I went for a long walk around the property. There were no signs of other people, no paths leading to or from the cabin. Just miles of untouched wilderness. By evening I started hearing strange noises again. This time it was the sound of branches snapping, almost like someone was walking through the woods outside. But when I went to investigate, there was no one there. I kept feeling like something was just out of sight, watching me. That night I decided to stay awake. I sat by the fire, listening to the forest, hoping to catch any strange sounds. And that's when I heard it again, the soft knocking on the door. But this time, it wasn't just on the door. It was coming from the windows, too. A soft tapping, like someone was gently knocking from the outside. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, this time with the intent of confronting whatever was out there. But when I stepped outside, there was nothing but stillness. No one was around. But something was off. I walked around the cabin, and that's when I noticed something odd. The cabin was different. It wasn't exactly the same as when I had first arrived. The building seemed to have shifted, slightly, but enough to make me feel disoriented. The angles weren't quite right. The porch, the roof, even the windows. They didn't match the way they had looked the day before. It was as if the cabin had changed overnight. I spent the next few hours in a daze, walking around the property, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The entire clearing around the cabin seemed to stretch on longer than it should have, and the trees in the distance appeared different as well. It was like the landscape had been rearranged, like I was in a different version of the forest. At some point, I realized that I was lost. I knew I hadn't moved, but the surroundings were so unfamiliar. The path I had walked earlier didn't lead back to the cabin. The landmarks I had seen in the daylight had disappeared or been replaced with something else. I tried to retrace my steps, but no matter where I went, I couldn't get back to the cabin. I kept hearing that same soft knocking on the trees, on the rocks, on the ground. The sounds seemed to come from all directions, echoing in the woods, as if the forest itself was alive and mocking me. As panic set in, I ran through the woods, trying to find any kind of familiar landmark, but the trees and shadows played tricks on me. The moonlight only made it worse, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. I couldn't see a way out. Hours passed, and by the time dawn finally came, I had wandered deeper into the woods, utterly disoriented. That's when I saw it, the cabin. It was standing in the exact spot I had left it, but it wasn't the same. The door was wide open, and inside, everything was in complete disarray. The furniture was overturned, the fire still burning, though no one had been inside. I walked towards the door, hesitant, my heart racing. But as I got closer, I noticed something, or rather, someone, in the window. A figure just standing there, watching me. I couldn't make out details, but the eyes were hollow, black, and they seemed to be beckoning me. That was it. I turned and ran. I didn't even look back. I didn't stop until I reached the road and flagged down a passing car. I got a ride back to the nearest town and spent the rest of the day trying to calm down. When I returned home, I did some research on the area. That's when I found out something terrifying. The cabin I had rented didn't even exist on any official map. It wasn't listed under any rental sites either. I tried reaching out to the owner, but there was no contact information. I even contacted the website where I had originally found it. They had no record of the listing. It felt like the cabin had been waiting for me, and it wasn't done with me yet. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that it's out there, somewhere in the woods, just waiting for the next person to stumble upon it.